now.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to panel 3 of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy. We're pleased to be able to hold a conference in this webinar format, and we thank you for joining us today. My name is Natalia Delgado, and I will be moderating this morning's panel. The panel is entitled Destrabando the Cuban Economy, an assessment of reforms in the road ahead. Joining the excellent group of economists who presented in yesterday's panels, today we will have presentations by 3 more prominent economists who have long studied and written about the Cuban economy. Jorge Pérez-López, who will discuss Raúl Castro's reforms and assess the progress and pending issues, will go first. Then Pavel Vidal Alejandro, who will consider the impact so far of the great lockdown of the Cuban economy due to COVID and describe the policy responses. And finally, Pedro Manuel Gonzalez, who will consider Cuban enterprises in Cuba and the sequence of economic reform. I will tell you more about each panelist right before their presentation. In the meantime, I wanted to now ask panelist Pavel Vidal to give you a few details about my professional background, and then I will introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here sharing this panel with Natalia, Jorge, Pedro. Let me introduce our host, Natalia Delgado. She's a senior research scholar at Colombia Law School and director of the Cuban Capacity Building Project, a project designed to foster the development of legal institutions necessary for Cuba to transition to a more market-based economy. She's a corporate and securities lawyer with over 30 years of experience with transactions and in various industries, as well as the financing of infrastructure projects for airports, schools, and museums. Prior to her tenure at Colombia Law School, she was the general counsel and member of the executive leadership team at Huron Consulting Group, a publicly traded consulting firm providing services to clients through the US and internationally. So welcome, Natalia.
Thank you very much, Pavel. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Jorge Pérez-López, who is known to all of us. He's an international economist who retired in 2005 as director of the Office of International Economic Affairs, Bureau of International Labor Affairs, US Department of Labor, in 2005 is the date of his retirement. Subsequently, he was director of monitoring and executive director of the nonprofit Fair Labor Association. He holds a PhD in economics from the State University of New York at Albany. He's a long-term student of the Cuban economy, particularly of the system of national accounts, international trade and investment, the sugar industry, and labor issues. He's the author of numerous publications on Cuba and is a former president of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy, the organization hosting this webinar. Jorge, please begin your remarks, and thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. It's a pleasure to be here at this session, virtual session of ASCE. I must say, I listened to the 2 sessions yesterday and I was very favorably impressed with the quality of the presentations, the attendance, and actually how, by and large, it worked without too many technical glitches, although there were a few. This is a first time for me to appear at an ASCE session in this medium, so a little hesitant, but I hope that it works out okay. The paper that I'm presenting today, and let me see if I can turn to the put the PowerPoint on. I need to hit share screen. Is that right?
Yes, you need to share the screen.
Okay. Okay, I have share screen now. From the beginning, and now where's slideshow? Okay, can everybody see it now?
Yes, we could see it.
Okay, so I've titled my paper, Raúl's Reforms, Actions, and Pending Issues. An earlier title had accomplishments or something else, but I want to make it very clear that I'm not, this paper is not about an assessment of the economic impact of the reforms as such. That would be an interesting thing to do, but that's not what this paper is doing. This is more of a sort of a catalog of the actions and the pending issues. Maybe during the discussion or during the presentations of my colleagues from Cuba, they may want to add something on the assessment of the effect of the measures, but that's not what I'm trying to do in this paper. What I call Raúl reforms in this paper is really a set of economic policy actions that the Cuban government has taken roughly between the period 2007 to 2017. In Cuba, these are not referred to as reforms per se. Reforms apparently not being a desired title to use, but they're actually called as actualización del modelo, or updating of the economic model. If you study the Cuban economic policy over time, you would have known, and Carmelo Mesalago has done a lot of work on this thing, that the economic policy zigzagged between what he called idealist policy cycles, when within the socialist model, there was an ideological pursuit of socialism, and there was an effort to eliminate any remnants of market-oriented tools. And there were also some pragmatist policy cycles where there were some tools or market levers that were introduced that were market-oriented. That zigzagged back and forth during the 60s through the 90s. However, in the early 90s, there were new type of reforms that were introduced, or policy changes. During the period called a special period, this was a very deep economic crisis. And I think the depth of the crisis required deeper measures. And these measures begin to change from socialism and towards market. And this market-oriented policies, which I won't go into them here, maybe we'll discuss them later on, were successful in bringing the economy, turning the economy around, together with some other external factors that also played a role, but they helped in overcoming that crisis of the special period. In the late 90s, early 2000s, Venezuela became a source of financial and investment assistance. And Cuba went through another cycle, ideological cycle, called Battle of Ideas, which to a large extent sought to come back to the sort of pure socialist model and move away from the special period market-oriented reforms. In the early, in the first decade of the 2000s, of course, there was a huge global financial crisis. Venezuela began to run into some problems, and it's fair to say that the Cuban economy was again at a crossroads at about the time when Raúl Castro rose to the top in Cuba. So basically, to set the stage, this Raúl's policies, Raúl's reforms, really happened in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, when Cuba had sort of run out of steam in terms of economic growth. This is a timeline which is a little busy, so I won't go into all of these points, but I try to color code it to sort of highlight some of the key points that I wanted to make. In red are sort of events that happened that are related to Raúl or to personnel. August 2006, Fidel is gravely ill. There's a temporary transfer of power to Raúl. In February 2008, Raúl is formally chosen to be the leader of Cuba. Raúl is reelected for 5 years in February 2013. He announces that he would not be a candidate for re-election, and Raúl Castro retires as president in April 2018, and he is Miguel Díaz-Canel takes over the Cuban leadership. So this sort of the 2016 to 2018 sort of are the brackets of the period that I'm looking at. In blue are some sort of external events that certainly had a lot to do with policies in Cuba. As I said earlier, the global financial crisis in 2007 and 2008 affected global credit markets and weakened the price of oil, affected Venezuela and the Cuban economy overall. In 2014, in December, you had the Obama US, the Cuba-US thaw, the idea that the United States and Cuba would work towards normalization of relations. And then there are some events around that that were, generally speaking, quite positive for Cuba. At least they augured as being quite positive, as the relationships with the United States were beginning to look more favorably. Of course, in June 2017, President Trump announces the cancellation of what he referred to as one-sided US policy towards Cuba. And then subsequently that leads to a series of measures that strengthen the sanctions against Cuba and made it more difficult for Cuba to exist in the international sphere. A very important point in sort of discussing these reforms is an address of July 26, 2007 by Raúl, where he had just recently taken over from his brother Vidal, still in a, I believe, still in a temporary basis. But he made a very important speech where he talked about the need for structural and conceptual reforms. And then shortly after that time, very extensive preparations for the Sixth Party Congress began. And I think, as I recall, I met with some Cuban colleagues in this 2007-2008 period, and they were pretty ecstatic, pretty excited about the fact that they were being consulted very broadly. The academics, people that were in the outside of government, they were being consulted about what things should be done. There was I think, euphoria about what to expect and how Cuba might be able to change its economic policies. Of course, the Party Congress, the Sixth Party Congress, happened in April 2011. There were very extensive lineamientos, guidelines that came out of that. There was also a permanent commission that was created to follow up on the implementation of the guidelines. The guidelines are by and large quite sound. However, it's sort of a laundry list. Everything is in the guidelines. And like everything else, it's all about implementation. Implementation was weak in many areas. In April 2016, there was another Congress of the Communist Party. I think here it was a bit ideological. Some of those documents, which are very difficult to read, the conceptualización del modelo económico y social cubano, los ejes de desarrollo, these are very heavy documents, but they really didn't add a lot to new measures. Again, the problem is not one of lack of ideas or measures, it's implementation. Turning to sort of specific actions, and this part of the paper rests on some work that I did with Carmelo Mesalago. The book is called Cuba under Raúl Castro, Assessing the Reforms, and I'm using the taxonomy that we developed in that book. the policy actions that I want to discuss are really of three kinds. One of them are what we might call administrative measures. This do not imply a change of the system at all. Their objective is modernization and restructuring of a state organization, and they're intended to improve efficiency and reduce costs. And examples of this are, of course, elimination of certain ministries and institutions, merging of some, wider application of perfeccionamiento empresarial throughout the economy. Another set of actions is what we call non-structural changes. And here, these are really measures intended to remove restrictions on the population or on enterprises. Marino Murillo, who was, he's no longer the Minister of the Economy. He has still, however, a fairly high level within the Cuban economic bureaucracy. He referred to these measures as eliminación de prohibiciones en la sociedad, essentially the lifting of restrictions and impediments in society. And examples here are, of course, the removal of restrictions on Cuban citizens being able to go into tourism hotels, being able to eat in certain restaurants, access of Cuban population to purchase electronic equipment, and more recently, automobiles, and then also creation of private markets for houses, for real estate, which up to that point had been prohibited. Finally, the more interesting group of reforms is what economists usually call sort of structural reforms, which are typically intended to make some changes to the socialist core of the system without eliminating socialism, but reducing the role of the state in the economy and disentangling economic impediments. This is what Cuban economists call today destrabar la economía, or desatar los nudos que entorpecen el desarrollo de las fuerzas productivas. Essentially, these changes to the system are the structural reforms that are the most important ones, and the ones that I intend to discuss in the rest of this paper. Structural reforms that are most significant during the period that Raúl Castro was in the leadership role, and the one that probably has been studied the most because there's the most data to do, is the distribution of agricultural land in usufruct to individuals. This is a significant action, and one that has had some positive impact in terms of increasing agricultural production, and it could have more in the future if it's continued to be pursued, and if there are certain changes that are made in the law itself, and also in complementary forms, such as making fertilizers and tools available, and so on and so forth. It's important to note that both in Vietnam and in China, the reforms that led to the economic improvement of those two countries sort of had their genesis, started out in the agricultural sector. In the case of China, it was called the contract responsibility system, where farmers were not given property of the land per se, but were allowed to use it with a certain discretion, and that led to agricultural production, created a a surplus for export and brought quite a bit of significant positive growth. Another important structural reform during the Raúl, that's part of the Raúl reform, is the retrenchment of the state sector and the expansion of private sector jobs that were allowed to be carried out in what's called in Cuba self-employment. Now, this already existed prior to 2007, 2008, but I think there was that this was thrust to a higher level during this period, and the number of categories that were allowed for self-employment was also increased. There were a few innovations that were made. For example, the idea of the home restaurants called paladares was not explicitly in the occupations, but I think there was a little creativity there by Cuban entrepreneurs and also by the administrators to allow this to take off, and that wound up being a fairly significant. That was a very significant reform at that time. We'll come to that in a minute because, of course, there's more to be done in that area, and there could be some movements in that direction today. There were other significant reforms that took place during this period. There was a reform to the non-agricultural cooperatives, and they were allowed to go into production and services, and this was up to that point the only area where cooperatives could operate was agriculture, and this was important to open it up to other sectors of the economy. There were some steps to permit restaurants and small shops to sort of group together and rent state facilities and to operate barbershops and sandwich shops. Again, small scale, but important in terms of authorizing some work in the private sector. There was a new tax code that also reduced red tape and simplified taxation for self-employed workers. And there was also a new foreign investment code, again, that tried to simplify and expedite the approval of foreign investment, which has been a long-standing problem. Having said that, there are some issues that have been sort of on the pending issues, things that have been mentioned in the lineamientos that have been discussed by leaders and by Cuban economists, of things that need to be done, but they haven't sort of gotten to them yet. I think there'll be another session tomorrow of this conference, which will be dealing with the monetary duality issue in some more detail. This is still a significant issue that is affecting Cuba in many ways and needs to be addressed, but has not been addressed properly to date. The rational system has been, again, an objective, something that wants to be eliminated. It hasn't been eliminated yet either. There's some, it appears that there are some changes that are going on these days that may be moving in that direction, but this is still a real serious issue that affects the overall economy. Enterprise reform, which can be interpreted different ways. One is you can interpret it as increased autonomy in decision-making for state enterprises. That's one way to look at enterprise reform, because there are still in Cuba quite a few state enterprises. But of course, there are also private enterprises, which in Cuba, a lot of them are called pymes, small and medium-sized enterprises. And I think Pedro is going to be talking about that a little bit later. So this is an area where there is a lot of work that remains to be done to try to resolve this issue. There's also the idea, of course, of the monopoly over foreign trade, which by and large is still a state function. There are some, again, limited pilots on certain areas, but
I'm sorry. You have about 1 minute left. I'm sorry. I just want to give you that heads up.
okay. So the monopoly over foreign trade is something that needs to be also addressed down the line. There is a legislative schedule or chronograma through 2022 that was approved by the National Assembly that has a fairly ambitious list of laws and so on that are likely to be done through this period. We'll come to that maybe in the question and answer if there's time. To conclude then, I think that there were high expectations that there would be significant changes in the economy when Raúl took over. I don't think there were any expectations of political changes, but certainly in the economic sphere, there was a great deal of expectations. There's no shortage of lists identifying the issues that need to be addressed, particularly in the lineamientos. There have been, of course, external economic events, such as the relationship with Venezuela, which at certain times has been very positive, but again, is a problem when Venezuela goes in crisis, and that has affected the way Cuba's ability to deal with these issues. The thaw in relation with the US of 2014, I think raised hope of accelerated changes, but in reality, there was not a lot that actually happened. And of course, since the Trump administration, the policies have been quite negative towards Cuba in the areas of remittances. The United States has done all it can to reduce Cuba's ability to derive income from health services exports. It has blocked investment from the US and from other countries as much as it can. The last sentence, the crisis that Cuba faces right now is quite significant. It has been made worse because it is a global recession, and tourism has dried up as a result of COVID-19 and making the situation very difficult. Maybe not quite as bad as the special period. We had Ricardo Torres yesterday making the point that the situation is very dire, but not quite as bad as the special period, because Cuba is in a better position today than it was before. I think there is an opportunity for this crisis expediting some changes. Cuba has made changes when the situation is dire, as in the special period, and therefore there's some hope that perhaps some positive things could come out in the economic policy area. Encouraging signs are the elimination of the surtax on US dollars, the opening of some wholesale markets, and there was an announcement by Minister of Labor Feijóo, I think it's her name, recently, that it's possible that the list of occupations that can engage in self-employment may be broadened, perhaps eliminating the so-called positive list, but that remains to be seen. Thank you, and I'm sorry for going over time.
No, Jorge, thank you very much for your presentation. The next panelist, and thank you. The next panelist that I'd like to introduce, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of all the presentations. And the next panelist is going to be Pavel Vidal Alejandro, who has served as a professor of economics since 2012 at the Pontificia University Javeriana in Colombia. Previously, he was a professor at the Center for the Study of the Cuban Economy at the University of Havana, and prior to that, he worked in the Monetary Policy Division of the Central Bank of Cuba. He received his doctorate in economics from the University of Havana. He specializes in macroeconomics and monetary policy with a focus on the reform process of Cuba, He served as a visiting researcher. He has served as a visiting researcher at leading universities and institutes in the US, Spain, and Japan. And he has been a consultant to the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, the Brookings Institution, Atlantic Council, UNDP, Banco de la República de Colombia, and Cuba Standard. Welcome, Pavel.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, we could see it.
Okay. Okay, thank you for having me. I think that my presentation might complement the thoughtful presentation that Jorge did about the timeline of the Cuban economic reform and the pending issues. No? I will try to put some numbers to that context, which means that I had to be very creative because we know that this is a situation that doesn't have any recent precedent. There are a lot of uncertainty, many unknowns in any economy. And in the case of Cuba, on top of that, we have the National Statistics Office that is, if you check out the brand new website, there is only one or two figures about the economic situation in 2020. So I will try to risk myself and try to put some numbers to this complex economic situation that maybe is not as severe as it was during the special period, but it will imply many challenges. So what I'm going to present is part of the economic trend report, something that I participate on a quarterly basis. And in this latest report, we try to analyze to estimate the size of this shock. I know that there is some estimates from CEPAL, some estimates from other sources. I will try to provide my own estimate, but more important that the final number that I'm going to present for the recession this year is to understand the channels that are dragging the GDP down and the uneven impact on different sectors. So I approach this estimate of the economic recession this year, analyzing the sensibility of the different across sectors to two channels. Because this is a combination of two shocks. It's the same. It's the pandemic, but we have like two channels, no? The international disruptions and the domestic disruptions. What I did was to measure or to measure this sensibility to these two channels, and that's the way that I finally came out with a number for the economic contraction this year. And finally, I'm going to analyze, I updated two indices that I just published like a few months ago in the journal Cuban Studies. I updated these two indices that reflect the stance of the monetary and the fiscal policy in Cuba. And that's the way I'm going to measure the wiggle room that the Cuban authorities or policymakers have to put in place to deploy relief programs and to add accommodation to the fiscal and monetary policy in order to weather this sizable shock. So sometimes we analyze Cuba, we tend to analyze Cuba as isolated cases, as unique cases, but this is not the approach that we are using here. We are trying to analyze the idiosyncratic aspects of the Cuban economy, but together with the common challenges and objectives that the Cuban economy have, because this is a global situation, and there are many disruptions that are going to affect the Cuban balance of payment, and we have to take that into account. So this is also a combination between a public health crisis and an economic crisis. We know that we are dealing sometimes we're trying to say that there is not a trade-off, but it is a trade-off in the short term between safe life and safe livelihoods. So we have to think how the Cuban government is dealing with this trade-off. Any economic projection has a lot of uncertainty embedded because this is a situation without any recent similar evidence that we can take into account. And this is also a combination of a supply side shock and a demand side shock. So we have to take into account these two sources of negative impact on the economy. And we know that this is not a one-off event. We don't know what is going to happen in the second half of the year. We might have a second and other wave of the spread of the virus. So we need to take into account the short-term effect, but also the long-lasting negative consequences for job security, inequality, and productivity. So this is a combination between trying to deal with the short-term implication, but also to be aware of the negative and also the positive trend that can emerge after the pandemic. So the policy recommendation is to act sizable, swiftly, to protect firms, to protect income family, but at the same time, we have to be aware and we have to expand structural reform to prepare the economy for the trends after the pandemic. So I think that Cuba is not a stranger to these challenges, global challenges. But that being said, we have to take into account the idiosyncratic aspects of the Cuban economy. I would like to mention some weaknesses that I think that Jorge mentioned, and Ricardo and Mesalago yesterday also mentioned that Cuba is receiving this new shock in a weakened economic position. There were some negative macroeconomic trends pre-crisis, pre this new crisis. So the Cuban government was using its limited borrowing capacity, its limited reserves, its limited policy space to weather the previous shocks. That's why now it's so difficult to put in place, to add accommodation to the fiscal and monetary policy without risking an acceleration in the inflation. And that's one of the main takeaway of my presentation. So there is a limited space to deploy relief programs and expansionary policy. Then we have another weakness, which is the high reliance on tourism. It's not particular of Cuba. It's something, a common challenge for the island economy in the Caribbean, and the poor IT infrastructure. We know that one way we have to worldwide to soften this blow is using the IT technology, IT infrastructure. I mean, homeschooling, schooling, teleworking, e-commerce, and because of the outdated telecommunication infrastructure in Cuba, that is not completely possible in Cuba, and something that we have to mention. And on the positive side, we have the strength of the Cuban healthcare system. And I think it's important that we acknowledge the success of the Cuban authorities in imposing these contact tracing and isolation measures that has been a key factor to contain the virus without imposing a total lockdown in the economy. And that's very important for the economic outlook, not to impose a total lockdown. And we know that the Cuban government have experienced managing this kind of extreme situation, this crisis. They have a PhD dealing with this kind of situation. we know that what they don't know how to handle is normalcy. What they don't know how to do is to promote progress. But in this extreme situation, they really know how to avoid a collapse. So in this context, what have been the policy response? They avoid a total lockdown of the economy. They've been imposing some partial lockdowns in some municipalities, in some areas, and they've been imposing some social distancing measures in order to, they decided to shut down public transportation, to close schools, to close non-essential businesses. And this is the way they've been dealing with this pandemic. They've been compressing imports. That's something that is going on for 3 years now. They've been expanding dollarization. They decided to retake this trend in the economic policy toward the enterprise system, granting more decentralization and autonomy. And now we know that in this trend of the economic policy, they might include the private sector. And they've been adding accommodation to the fiscal and monetary policy. They've been adding accommodation. This is something that I'm going to show you later in the two indices, but they've been adding accommodation since over the last 5 years. And now this year, we don't have the exact number of the review that they did of the state budget and the economic plan. But we know that we are going to have an increase in the deficit because they've been adding temporary tax breaks and wage subsidies to the state workers. And they've been promoting, fostering the export of medical services in order to offset the impact on remittances, tourism, and commodity export of commodity. And now we know that they receive some cautiously optimism the announcement of the Minister of Economy and Planning saying that they are committed with a new phase of the economic reform. But we have many reasons to be skeptical about the execution. We don't know how they are going to pass, for example, how they are going to pass legislations through the National Assembly, because that is the very same National Assembly that stopped the economic reform. So there are many institutional and political challenges down the road. So let's try to put some numbers to this context. This is my empirical strategy. As I said, I'm considering these two transmission channels from the international disruptions and from the domestic disruptions associated to the social distancing measures. And what I'm doing is that I am measuring the sensibility across sectors to these two shocks. I mean, everything has to do with the pandemic, but there is like two channels affecting the Cuban economy. So that's what I'm doing. I'm using this well-documented relation between the balance of payment constraints and the behavior of the Cuban GDP. To do that, I employed time series econometric techniques, and the other exercise is just an accounting exercise measuring what are the sectors that were hit by the social distancing measures. Basically, it's trade, transportation, and services, but not agriculture, manufacturing, and mining. And this is the result of my estimate. This is the result of my simulations. As you can see, the final resort is that I am projecting that the Cuban GDP is going to shrink 8.7% this year. And all the sectors, we are going to be affected by this situation. This is a pandemic that is having an impact across the board. But we can see that the hospitality is the sector that is going to be more heavily impacted with a forecasted decline of 35%. And hospitality is a sector that is receiving this overlapping impact from the social distancing measure and from the international disruptions. The international disruptions, I think I estimated that is going to produce a decline in the export of goods around 19%. Remittances are going to be down 16%, and foreign visitors is going to decline 60%. They all together will force the Cuban authority to contract, to reduce imports in around 27%. And this is going to take a heavy toll on the tradable sectors, agriculture, manufacturing, and mining, that sector that thanks that the Cuban government avoid to impose a total lockdown, they are not more heavily affected. Another way to present these numbers is doing this accounting exercise, trying to calculate the contribution to the GDP contraction by type of shock. As I said, I am using this empirical strategy in which I have separated these two. I mean, everything is, there are many interconnectedness, but in order to understand what is forcing the Cuban economy to go down, we have we can use this approach. And we can see that these two channels, these two shocks, are equally important in explaining the 2020 economic recession, the balance of payment constraints and the social distancing measures. And with the same numbers, I did this other accounting exercise, trying to compute the contribution of each sector to the 2020 economic recession. And as you can see, services, trade, hospitality, and transportation are accounting the largest contribution, negative contribution to the economic downturn this year. The contribution of agriculture, manufacturing, mining, and construction is marginal, and that's because not only because they are not imposing a total lockdown, but because of the production structure of the Cuban economy, where this sector have a lower participation compared to services and trade. And finally, this is the two indices that I am updating. No? I have an index to measure the stance of the fiscal policy that include total fiscal expenditure, subsidies to state-owned enterprises, fiscal deficit as a proportion of the GDP, and the average salary in the state sector. And in conjunction with this index, I also presented, because there is a dependency of the monetary policy to the fiscal policy, I am presenting this other index that includes the money supply, the individual saving accounts as a percentage of GDP, the consumer price index in Cuban peso, and the exchange rate of the Cuban peso to the dollar. And this is the trajectory of the fiscal index. You can see the peak in the early 90s, then the economic the adjustment, the one we call the so-called medidas de saneamiento financiero that reduce the fiscal deficit and rebalance the economy at that time. Then we have this period of relative stability since 1995 up to 2005. Then we have this upward trend connected with what Jorge said about the Batalla de Ideas, the expansion of expenditure in social services, leading to the 2008-2009 domestic financial crisis in Cuba. Then you see
1 minute.
1 minute is enough. The correction that Raúl Castro implemented in these imbalances, and finally you can see the upward trend, the worrying trend of the fiscal position, fiscal stance. Is we are not yet at the same level of the early 90s, but I think these are trends that are showing the narrow space that the Cuban government has to put in place expansionary policy without risking inflation. And take it to account that I am not using the 2020 data point. I'm just using the data up to 2019. The monetary policy index has the same trajectory. They move in tandem because of the dependency of the monetary policy to the fiscal policy. And at the end, you see the same trend. So the Cuban government will probably add accommodation to the fiscal and monetary policy, but at some point, they will have to level off this trend. If they don't do that, they are going to risk an acceleration of inflation. And finally, this is my remarks. I am projecting a contraction of the GDP of 8.7%, which is lesser than that of the IMF is projecting to Latin American country, and it's lesser than the decline that the Cuban GDP had in 1991. But it's higher, it's deeper than the recession that we had in 1990. Social distancing measures and the balance of payment constraints are equally important in explaining the GDP contraction this year. Services, trade, transportation, and hospitality account for 88% of the total GDP contraction this year. Cuban authorities have a very limited space to continue accommodating fiscal and monetary policy without risking a higher inflation. And it's a good news that there is this announcement in which they are saying that they are going to take the Cuban structural reform to a new level. We have to wait and see. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pavel. We will now move on to our next final panelist of today. Pedro, could you unmute your microphone and join us? I can't see you, so maybe you need to unmute, have your video going.
Yeah.
Okay, good. We can't see you. We can only see your name.
Yeah, but the video, the audio is good, but the video is said that someone is controlling this. I cannot start it.
Huh. I'm not doing it. Larry, could you check, Larry and Frank, could you check on that, please? While you're doing
Larry need to make him a co-host so he could share the screen. Larry? He's a co-host now.
Okay,
he
he's
share the
appearing
screen
now.
So it's okay? Okay.
Yes, okay. So let me say a few words about Pedro. Pedro Monreal is a program specialist at UNESCO in the sector on social and human services, where he coordinates international projects on capacity development and economic inclusion in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Previously, he coordinated projects on capacity development for juveniles to combat poverty in various English-speaking Caribbean nations. He has a doctorate in economic sciences from the University of Havana and a postgraduate degree from the University of Southern California, USC. For more than 30 years, he has taught courses in a variety of economic subjects. Professor Monreal is the author of numerous books and articles on the Cuban economy and international development, and he has been a visiting scholar at leading universities and institutes in the US, Japan, Denmark, and Germany. He was honored in 2003 with the UNESCO Prize in Caribbean Thought in Economics. Please begin, Pedro, and thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here because we have some delay. I will go immediately to share my screen. Okay. Oops. Sorry. Sorry. Okay. So basically, what I will do is to present how firms, companies, are part or not of what is happening now in Cuba in terms of the adaptation of the Cuban economy, not only to the short-term circumstances, but also to a longer view of development. And although when we listen to the discussions in Cuba in terms of employment and in terms of productivity and in terms of firms, I think it's important to make the strong point that the debate in Cuba about firms, about companies, about the small and medium size private companies, all this discussion is basically about employment and productivity, which are two key elements, notwithstanding the ideological or political considerations that you could make, which are important. These are the basic issues. And this is a kind of photography of Cuban economy today in terms of employment. I am reflecting here only the non-budget area of the economy, so enterprises. And it's very easy to see what is happening now. This is the current situation of the economy in Cuba. It's basically a situation where the size of the state economy in terms of employment of the state-owned enterprises is about the same size of the private economy in Cuba. When you put together trabajo por cuenta propia and the rest of the private sector, which is basically agriculture. Now, in terms of productivity, I think we have a problem. In this chart, the size of the chart indicates the number of workers in sectors. And when we usually discuss productivity in terms of how much productivity should grow in order to accommodate increases in salary, I think this is key. The largest sector in Cuba in terms of employment is by far agriculture. And when you look carefully, it's the sector with the lowest level of productivity. So we have a bottleneck there. And this is something that is very important to address the issues of development in Cuba now and the issues of transformation in Cuba now. As you all know, agriculture is probably the sector more advanced in terms of the diversity of economic actors. It has a large state sector, but in addition to that, you have large cooperatives and they have a lot of private activity, both based on the property of land and also on the leasing of state land to people in the last 8 years. Now, the problem that we have now when we go to what is happening in Cuba in the last 10 years, it's very easy to understand in that chart, in the sense that the size of the state sectors, and this is it's mixed, it's enterprises plus budget entities, has been decreasing, while in the case of the non-state sector, which is the cooperative and private, is growing. But then we have another look at this, and the blue line is private. It's both, I mean, all forms of private. It's trabajadores por cuenta propia, and it's also agriculture. And this is a key issue. I mean, what is happening now is a clear indication of the limits of the possibility of growing employment in the state sector, but also the need to accommodate any excess employment in the state sector in the private sector or in cooperatives. When you look at the chart, the very active sectors has been the private sector, not the cooperative. And this is something to bear in mind, taking into account that according to many estimates, still there are between 300 and 500,000 workers in the state sector that should be removed from the payrolls at some point if you want to have a solid, robust, and efficient state sector. Then I think this chart is interesting for one thing, that it shows that in a context where the country is having a very important restriction in terms of increasing capital to increase production and productivity, the key issue has been that productivity has been growing in Cuba, but at the same time, part of the explanation, not all the explanation, but part of the explanation is that it has been a huge reduction in state employees. Now, and this is something that usually comes to discussions in Cuba, right? We don't have the numbers in Cuba. We don't have the figures for Cuba, but we do have for other countries, including Vietnam. And what I'm trying to present there is something that for some reason is not part of the debate in Cuba now, which is the very easy to understand differences in productivity that exist between large enterprises and very small business. And in the case of Vietnam, privados sin licencia, the yellow column, it doesn't mean that this is informal. In Vietnam, the law established that some kind of activities that in Cuba need a license, they are not needed in Vietnam, like street vendors or people who are having a universal business in their portal or something, right? So this is the key issue here. Because what is happening in Cuba now is a question about how do you move people from the blue column to the other columns? And what we have in Cuba now is basically a process where we're moving people from the blue column to the yellow column. We don't have a small and medium enterprises in Cuba. Now, I think there is a problem of sequence here. In my personal experience, in many cases where it's my case and the case of other colleagues, when we talk about a small, medium enterprises in Cuba, some people say, okay, but you should talk first about what to do with the state-owned enterprise. And of course, they have a point. But my answer always is, okay, those are two sides of the same coin. And in terms of thinking into a program that will increase the efficiency, the productivity, the robustness of the state sector, you need to have first in place the kind of institutions that will allow this state sector to move into the path of reform. In other words, you need to have some mechanisms for creating employment the employment that you will not have in the state sector because you will be firing people from the state sector. And second, it's not only a place where you will have to accommodate people to have some kind of income working, but you need to ensure that in that sector, in that non-state sector, in that private sector, you will reach the highest possible levels of productivity. For sure, not as high as the potential that you may have, which is a large enterprise, but this is something that you will do. So, I would say that not many, but the economists that I have talked to in Cuba, many of them have this idea that in terms of sequence, the establishment of a small and medium-sized enterprises in Cuba should be happening now. And only after we have this in place, you could move to the other stages. What is reflected there is not an official position. It's my understanding of what could be done, not necessarily should be done, but what could be done within the current framework of policy change in Cuba, the reform or the actualization of the model. Now, something that is very important to deal with enterprises is the issue of the planning system in Cuba. Because of course, state-owned enterprises and the rest of what is happening in the economy will be framed by the general institutional mechanism that we have to regulate the economy. In the case of Cuba, this is central planning, which incidentally is very interesting because although the insistence is to have central planning, somehow you frequently listen the idea of doing a more light mechanism for that. It's confusing in this clarification, and this is the proof that I have. If this is official thing, and they present as a big thing that there has been a reduction in the number of directive indicators in the preparation of the plan for the next year. 113 directive indicators. That's too much. This is a very heavy centralized planning system. This is not compatible at all with thinking in having efficient and flexible state-owned enterprises. But this is something that we have to be discussed at some point. It has not been discussed at all in Cuba. I mean, that's a conversation on that, but not a debate on that. Now, in any case, something is better than nothing. And some of my colleagues have been identifying some of the issues that are happening here. Certainly, there has been some action or the idea to have action in the area of trabajo por cuenta propia in Cuba, right? And this is what has been recently explained, like 2 weeks ago, by the Minister of Work in Cuba, of Labor in Cuba, and there has been a lot of conversation about this. It's a famous discussion of the list. It's a list of activity would be a negative list, or how flexible would be the system, whatever. So I say that something is better than nothing, because I think that the discussion should be right now about a small and medium enterprise, not about this, right? Well, that would be part of that discussion, but the main element could be other the small and medium enterprises which are not now part of the discussion. Now, when I try to look carefully at what is happening, this is what I see, right? Remember, on 16th of July, there was a general presentation of the plan for restructuring the economy. And there were some general information about what they call medidas, as policy actions. And when you screen out of the medidas, many of those are simply statements. So I try to identify the ones that maybe will be more important. I'm trying to identify the days that we have thus far on this, and if we know the schedule. The most important one, which is food production and commercialization. If you look at the statements, they mention a lot of things. We will not allow any more monopolies on this. We will have decentralization of the process of establishing prices. We have a reduction in the number of intermediaries. We will have a reduction in the entry barriers of people to commercialize products, etc., etc. However, beyond that, we don't have any public details on this, and the schedule is unknown. I mean, people are waiting that the Minister of Agriculture will go to the television to explain this. But this is a key area. Remember, it's the largest employer of the sector, of the economy, and it's the lowest productivity, and besides that, it's food. Now, the diversification of export-oriented actors is clear, the detail. The export will be through state-owned enterprises. Yesterday, there was conversation on this. The process already started with the preparation of the state enterprises to do that. Then we have the creation of a wholesale market of productive inputs for non-state actors in hand currency. That will be again through state-owned enterprises. It will start in September. Then we have a wholesale market of productive inputs for trabajadores con cuenta propia in national currency. Again, through a state enterprise. It already started with a very limited scope of products. Then we have the small and medium enterprises, which has been mentioned, but not detailed, other than it will be a combo. It will be, now when they talk about payments, they talk about private payments and state-owned payments, whatever that could be. And there's no schedule for that. And then the expansion of non-agricultural cooperatives and the expansion of flexibilización de trabajo por cuenta propia, which I previously showed a slide on this. The most interesting thing of what is happening is the pilot project in the area of restaurants and cafeterias. They are using an old solution from last year, which basically allows state entities, cafeterias, restaurants, to make a very flexible kind of contract with the private sector. This is an ongoing experiment. This is happening now. And then maybe the most important of the measure explained with some detail is that there will be a transfer of assets from state-owned enterprises to non-state actors. Meaning by this that institutions and the buildings, facilities, some machinery, whatever, they could be transferred to cooperatives or private sector. It is not new. It was done before in small scale, but we don't know exactly when. Now, what we have here is like three possible scenarios, right? And you see in the horizontal axis, we have the percentage of assets on the central direct control, and then the other axis is the percentage of non-state employment. The yellow one is unacceptable in official view. The current one is a green one, where we have a lot of assets in centrally controlled by the state, and we have like about an equilibrium of a state between employment between state and non-state. Then we have the desirable, which is official view. This is the conceptualization. The idea is to have a centrally planned economy, but at the same time, they are saying that they will have more employment on the other side. And then something that is a potential, which is, I think, perhaps official second best. To put very succinctly, although I don't like to talk about models, this is the Chinese Vietnamese thing, right? Now, the path from the current situation to the other scenarios. The red one is the number one, is apparently what is happening now. The second one, maybe it will be forced by circumstances. It will be a kind of adjustment, right? And the yellow one is the one that I think many economists, which I have talked to, would like to have, but this is simply not happening. I mean, there is nothing indicating that this will happen. Again, I think that what we will have now in terms of the pressure to accommodate employment and productivity, in principle, we will advise to have as a path the number 3. But frankly speaking, the kind of indications, the kind of small evidence that we have from the current announcements, official announcement, will indicate that this is not feasible, at least for the moment. So that's all, and I will be glad to answer your questions or respond to a comment. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Pedro. And we're now in the question and answer section of the panel. And Larry has said that we can go over time since we started late. So what I'd like to do is, I had a question, but then I saw that other people had similar questions. So my question was generally, like, what are the impediments to all of these things that they say they're going to do but don't happen? But Gary Meiberduck actually stated it more precisely, so let me read his question. He said, as Jorge has pointed out, the internal debate within the Cuban government and Communist Party has been reflected in the policy proclamations of both the 6th and 7th Party Congresses. Do you believe the Cuban administration has the willingness and understanding to execute strong reform policies? Will they be able to enforce these changes in the likely face of bureaucratic opposition? And I invite, I guess, Pedro and Pavel, Jorge too, if you'd like to answer those questions, but let's see if we can have a conversation going. The second set of questions have to do with agriculture, and then there's some very specific questions, which I'll take at the end if we have time, but we have a little extra time. So it won't end exactly at noon, so please go ahead.
Who starts?
No, either you, Pedro and Pavel. Why don't you two answer that?
Pedro, you can start.
Sure.
It's about the political institutional resistance to the changes that they've been announcing. I think the speech of the Minister of Economy it could be a game changer. I think that in the government they have I think that they have the perception that they have to further the economic reforms, that the status quo, the business as usual situation it's not going to guarantee a recovery from this pandemic. I think that they have a clear view that this is something that they have to do. Of course, they have to do a lot to convince that this time is going to be different, that this time this is going to be, there is not turning backs, that this is going to be for good. And they are designing a new policy, but we know that they have to pass new legislations, and they have to go, that has to go through the National Assembly, and we know that the Communist Party have a control of the electoral process, and they point and select exactly who is going to be a deputy in the National Assembly, and the National Assembly was the one that resisted the Raúl Castro reform, resisted the proposal of Marino Murillo. So I think one of the main obstacles is going to come from the National Assembly, and we have to see what is going to happen next year in April, because it is the time in which the next Communist Party is going to, the next Congress of the Communist Party is going to take place. And we need to see if the Communist Party is going to give a full endorsement to this new policy. So I think that they have to prove, the government will have to prove they have control of the whole process, from the design of the policy to the execution to the political support. And that's the way they are going to convince that they are going to take the structural reform to a whole new level.
Yeah. Would you like to add something? Yeah.
Yeah, very quickly. I just point out to the classical thing of political economy, right? The dimension of interest here. Okay, because if we are seriously talking about reforming the Cuban economy, it doesn't matter the name that is given to this. There could be three elements, three pillars of the current model that will have to be modified. One is the structure of property. It has to change. Second is prices. I mean, the role of price in the regulation of the economy, right? And the third one is the establishment of a market for capital goods in Cuba, even for the state sector, right? If you don't have these three, you will be moving in cycles, right? Now, the question is, the very day that you start to modifying a structure of property prices and establishing internal markets for capital goods, you will modify the balance of internal balance of power in Cuba. Meaning by this, that you will be transferring power to non-state actors, and within the state, you will be transferring power out of the central apparatus to the provinces. And of course, this is something that is a very complex process. Let me finish with two things. One, in terms of the structure of property, one of the infatuations apparently that exists now with modifying trabajo por cuenta propia is that this is a very convenient way to avoid the discussion about private enterprises, right? Because apparently the idea will be not only to expand trabajo por cuenta propia to expand the number of people working on that will never be a private enterprise, or that there will be a cooperative. That would be one. There is a discussion in agriculture in terms of what would you do with the usufructuarios, with the land from the state. This is a big question. And in the case of the market for capital goods in Cuba, the government only has two options now when an state enterprise is not doing well, and just two options. It can shut down the enterprise, or it can subsidize the enterprise. There is no other mechanism for doing that, which is the kind of mechanism that exists in other common structures. They have a market for reorganizing assets and separating components and creating new enterprises. They do that in China. They do that in Vietnam. I think they do in North Korea. They don't have in Cuba. But again, this is classical political economy. You will be moving. You will be very important pillars of the economy, and that has political implications for power.
Okay, does anybody want to add anything else? If not, let me ask you some questions that have to do with agriculture. A couple of questions came in, one from Jirdi Brusek and Mario Gonzalez Corso. And let me just state it in the words of Mario Gonzalez Corso, because again, the questions are more specific. His questions are, do you or any of the other panelists, and I don't know who it's directed to, I think probably all three of you, foresee a future transition where agricultural property rights are expanded beyond usufruct? If so, under an ideal scenario, in your view, what would types of agricultural property rights reforms would you recommend in the medium and long term? And the third part of the question is, how important are, in your view, additional agricultural reforms, such as eliminating or replacing acopio, price liberalization, allowing private foreign investment in the agricultural sector, and opening wholesaler input markets run by the private sector, etc. I think that question subsumes, or Jury's question subsumed in that. So I hope that he agrees. If you could please turn your attention to that one, we'd appreciate it. So who wants to start? Jorge?
Let me start, and then I'll let the Cuban colleagues comment on the others. I don't see the usufruct expanded to result in real property rights. Pedro, I think you've done a lot of work on Vietnam, and you've been there in missions a number of times. Maybe you know this better than I do, but I think the idea of usufruct with very long period of time and keeping it for 50 years, 100 years is a very convenient way, because you sidestep the issue of really having to define property rights, because that raises a whole series of political economy issues that are really difficult to handle. So I think that there are ways to get around that by expanding the nature of the people who can actually get the usufruct rights, expanding the activities that can be practiced, allowing some of them to join together with others in the same way. So I think those are ways to de facto create the same thing, but sort of sidestepping the very difficult issue of property. But I'd like to hear what the others have to say.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. Actually, if I mean the Chinese model is also that. I mean, there is no private property of land in China, period. And they have been doing this for exactly the same reason that you have. Maybe the difference that exists in China is that in the case of land is not owned by individuals, but they're owned by comunas and provincial entities, whatever. And what they have, which is something that of course is a headache, is that sometimes out of corruption, I mean, these authorities find ways to reduce agricultural land and transform it to urban land to do kind of business, right? But you're totally right. I think that I have not seen any serious conversation in Cuba at no level in terms of thinking in transforming usufructo in property. No conversation, as far as I know.
Not. We cannot hear you, Natalia. On mute.
Excuse me, thank you. I have a couple of questions that are related. So let me ask you, let me present both. One is from Ted Henkin, and it's for Pedro. And before you answer it, Pedro, let me ask both questions. What changed to spur the government to declare a change of course vis-a-vis TCP and the PYMEs? And also another participant asked, what are in your charts, you refer to TCP private but not TCP, and he was unsure about what you were referring to with respect to that. And I think it was from, I'm sorry, I can't find the name of the questioner, but that was the question. And there's a related question, which is from Roger Betancourt, and that is, what is the legal status of the PYMEs right now? So I think that group of questions, perhaps you can take together, Pedro.
Okay. In the case of the information in the chart, the table, the private sector in Cuba basically is comprised in two main groups. One, which is the most famous one, is Trabajadores por Cuenta Propia, right? It's the one that is new, it has been expanding, that's one. But there is a lot of private activity in farms in Cuba, which is not TCP. First, because we have had for years, I mean, since the beginning of the Cuban Revolution, we have private farmers, right? But in addition to that, we have a very large group of people in the last 8-9 years, which is usufructuarios. And this is important. 2 million hectares of land, 2 million, were delivered to usufructuarios, right? The actual size is a bit less because people have some land, but it's very large. So this is the first thing. And the first part, I forgot it. The first part.
Yeah, the first part of the question had to do with what motivated, it was from Ted, what motivated, what spurred the government to declare a change of course vis-a-vis the TCP and the PMIS?
Okay. Basically, one issue, employment. There's no way that the government, the state, can hire people without having a disastrous effect in the economy, right? I mean, they could do it by printing money, but they can't because there is no capital available to create those jobs, right? So this is the first thing. It's a very well-known limitation. Now, what was happening before the pandemics is that we already have in Cuba this huge group of people in Trabajo por Cuenta Propia, which is quite diverse, but they have employment and they have income. And they were part of the creation of demand in Cuba, and they were part of the social stability in Cuba. That has been severely hit. Boom, it's very strong. I mean, the last number that I saw, it was like 243 licenses has been canceled. I mean, temporarily canceled. Because a large percentage of TCP in Cuba depended on tourism or business around tourism. And Pavel has the numbers, provide the numbers. So the question is, what to do with these people that the state cannot accommodate? And second, what the state should be doing with enterprises. Let me tell you this. There are enterprises in Cuba at the very day that a serious reform for the autonomy of enterprises using prices starts, they will have a lot of people. They will have to fire out people. The very day in Cuba devaluate the peso, you will have another outflow of people. So you need to accommodate that. And the way they are doing this, I think, is not going to the discussion of PYMEs, which is the one that I think is important, because what I mentioned before, because it gives you a ceiling of productivity much higher than TCP. And what they are trying to do is trying to do a more flexible approach to this, which I think is important. What they said is that the list that were very narrow and rigid will be eliminated. They didn't say they will eliminate lists. They will have the new list, which are more flexible and they are wider in the scope to accommodate people. And maybe they will have a negative list for the things that everybody knows that private people in Cuba will not do, mining, sugar, this kind of thing. Now, the point is, you have now a description of activities in TCP. Licencias in Cuba are given by task, right? You are selling water, very strange names, right? The option to that is to give the license by activities. And you have the illicit activities. You don't have to invent that. In Cuba, there is un normador de actividades económicas where every possible activity in Cuba is identified. So instead of saying, if you say you have a license to work, let's put one example, in agriculture. It doesn't matter if you do something with the ox, or if you do something with horses, of when you go to the top of a palm tree to cut down palmiche, all this. Because what is happening now, and this is interesting, the pandemic has shown that managing something as diverse of TCP needs flexibility in terms of allowing people to find themselves an accommodation to changing circumstances without having to go the full process or new licenses because they're very specific. I think this is what is happening. Now, the problem is that in the case of TCP, they have what I call a proto-enterprise segment. They are not enterprises because they're not legalized as enterprises, but they work very differently. And then you have some big restaurants, and then you have some big automotive shops, these kind of things, right? I think that what they are thinking in terms of those kind of TCP, which is not your usual TCP, is finding ways to accommodate what they call a partnership with the state enterprises. So I'm not sure they will be developed into full PYMEs, but in something that will be like a proto-PYME with some kind of contract with the state enterprise. Maybe.
Okay, I'm getting a lot of questions. I don't know if I'll be able to get to all your questions, and I apologize if I don't. I'm trying to group them. But I have one from Silvia Pedraza and a kind of a related question from Miguel Villalon. So Sylvia's question is for you, Pedro. She wants to know, as workers move out or are moved out from the state employment sector to the private sector, which is an important structural reform, are they not giving up on the safety net that they currently have? Because, as Elias Brauamor points out in his paper yesterday, the self-employed sector in Cuba are completely disprotected. They don't receive unemployment insurance and other benefits the state workers have. So that's one question. And then related to that is one from Manuel Villalon, who says, how reliable are your numbers? Despite the growth in population, total employment in the last 5 years has gone down. It seems like the labor participation of the population is very low, and there's a private activity that's not included in the official statistics. And then I guess there's a third one, which is from Yosiel Marrero, and for you again, Pedro, and he wants to know, at stage 2, the transfer of state enterprises to provincial governments, mainly thinking about the agro-state enterprises, and will be managed by the provincial governments, is his question. So whether, I think the question is, in the transfer of state enterprises to the provincial governments, is the thinking that the agro-state enterprises will be managed by the provincial governments? Or how is that going to work? I think that's the question.
Okay.
So Sylvia's, and then the numbers from Manuel Villalon, the statistics that are related to the labor force, and then finally Yosiel's here.
Okay, yes. Okay, the population has not been growing that high, but it's true that the active population has been going down, has been reduced. My numbers, my figures, my calculation is that it's 2.2 million people in Cuba who are not either working or studying. I mean, I'm talking about the group of people between 17 and 64 who are not studying, neither working, is very high. It's 2.2 million. What? This is a huge problem. What? Well, they are not legally working. They are doing something, right? We have now this discussion about coleros, about the thing. It has to do with that, right? So this is the first thing. The second thing is that in terms of the TCP, which is now in a very complicated situation, as we have explained, but they were about 250,000, quarter million, about that, more or less. The problem with that is that 26% of these people are not TCP. 26% of the people are wage workers. So when you think in terms of structuring activities, the first thing that you will have to do is to remove from TCP that people and treating them as wage workers with the same kind of labor protection that you allocate to any other type of wage worker in Cuba, right? And then you will have the protection automatically for this 26% of TCP. Then, with the rest of TCP, my understanding is that the idea will be as part of the reform, is to introduce a new mechanism for creating insurance for TCP, which works very differently when you are a universal business person when you have an enterprise, a proto enterprise, right? But that will be, this is definitely part of the conversation. How to offer the protection that is very clear that they need now. The second element that I think is important here, the third element is important here, is that when we talk about the establishment or the possible establishment of pymes in Cuba, there are two different things. I mean, people say, well, okay, we need a law for pymes. Yeah, sure, we need a law later. If you know, what we need now is not a law, it's a normative to establish pymes, which is different from the law for pymes. If you look one by one, legislation on pymes everywhere, they are not even called law for pymes. They're called law for the support of pymes. Because every government in the world understands that pymes need support because they are so small and they have a very important function, which is employment. In some cases, they employ 90%, 80% of employees in countries. But you need to protect them. And pymes are protected by any kind of measure, any kind of imaginable measure. This is a law for pymes. What we need now is to establish pymes. You could have it with a resolution, with a decree. You don't need a law. Actually, it will be easier because you already have, I mentioned again, in the TCP sector, you have a very well identified segment, which are enterprises. Boom, it's legalizing this. Allowing this to start. It's not that difficult. But of course, you have to do that in such a way that you will be incentivizing that other newcomers will be transformed in pymes. But this is my basic point. This is my discussion with anyone. We don't need now a law on pymes. If we are talking about a real law on pymes, we need a normative which could be developed very quickly to allow the legalization of existing pymes and providing the framework for that. I'm forgetting something, but okay.
Okay, I'm glad that you made that point because everybody talks about this private sector in Cuba as if they're pymes, but actually not really recognized as pymes. They could also be recognized as such, but as a first step. But let's see, I had a question from Yosiel that had to do with the transfer of agricultural enterprises to local governments.
Yeah.
And his question was, are the local governments gonna like manage the agricultural enterprises, supervise them, or how's that gonna work?
Yeah, okay. It has to do with the idea that at some point you will have a planning system that will be different from the one that exists. The government says we will have, the central planning is a pillar of what we're doing. Sure, define central planning, because I don't know, maybe we're talking about different things, right? Chinese used to say for many years, that they were doing central planning, which was different what they were doing. They are not saying anymore this, right? So this is very important thing. The basic point would be that if we my basic point is this. You can have the economic control of a country if you control 30%, 40% of assets. If you keep the big fish, this is a Chinese expression, if you keep the big fish and you keep credit, you control the country, you control the economy. You modify the directions in the economy. This is what they are doing. I'm not saying Cuba should be done that. I'm saying that this is happening in countries where they have a common country. This is what I'm saying. Now, in order to do that, and China has thousands of state enterprises, thousands. They have millions of private enterprises, thousands of state enterprises. You know how many companies in China are centrally controlled? 92. The big fish, the whales of the, and not even some whales which are all things like big textile factories, all the things. This is provincial government. Those are municipal government. So technically, you can keep the state-owned enterprises, but the control of this, which will be a control basically in terms of controlling assets, no, the day-to-day operation of business will be in the hands of provincial levels. Let me give you one clear example in Cuba. Sugar mills. I mean, we don't have many now, sugar mills, or agricultural business, or even all these, they are called mini industrias now in food production. This is a business of, if you want to keep that state-owned, you cannot put that in the hands of a central control. You will need this thing that we have now, like 113 directive indicator or something. That's messy. But that would be the idea. This is, again, I'm not saying this should be done in Cuba. I'm not saying this can be done in Cuba. I'm saying this has been done in other countries and it works. Not perfectly, but it works.
Okay, we still have a number of questions, and I haven't given any of the panelists an opportunity to ask questions of other panelists. So are there questions that you would like to ask of each other before I go back to the list of questions I've received? Pavel and Jorge. Pavel?
No.
No? Okay.
No,
well, I have gotten a list of questions from John McAuliffe, and I apologize that I haven't been able to read any of them. They're long. And so what I thought I would do is just get to the last question he asked, which is a complete end of the US embargo linked to a political settlement to Venezuela, does that risks Cuba's special relationship with Venezuela? Is that likely to be a net gain or a net loss for the Cuban economy? If internationally credible elections produce a new governing coalition in Venezuela that continues use of Cuban medical services in return for oil supplies, would that be ideal in conjunction with, okay, I think that's generally the question. I don't see the rest of it. I hope that that's understandable enough if anybody wants to respond to that one. And then I have a series of technical questions. I guess, let me see if I can summarize it differently. If there's a total lifting of the embargo, okay, what do you want to comment generally on what will happen if there's a total lifting of the embargo on some of the comments that you made today about this process of reform? What will be the impact on the process of reform? Pavel and Pedro.
Or Jorge.
Oh, Jorge.
This is highly speculative and really out of my preparation for today. I think this is a sort of fishing expedition here. Maybe there's a panel. It would have been perhaps more appropriate for yesterday's panel on the external relations. So I would rather pass. I mean, these are interesting questions, but I'm not competent really or prepared to comment extensively on that.
Pavel, do you have a comment on that?
I feel that's above my pay grade.
Pedro?
Well, let me, this is crystal ball thing, right? But of course, any modification on the current, on the international context in which Cuba has to do things will have an impact. I mean, a basic understanding of how things work will indicate that, of course, is the embargo is lifted, the environment will be quite different, and maybe will happen, I'm sure, a set of elements will change for good, and opportunities will modify. How this modification will impact in long-term things, I don't know. In the short term, it will have an impact. I'm not talking, I'm not speculating. That happened 3 years ago, 4 years ago. That happened. It happened to me. I went to Havana next February after the normalization of relations. There was a change. I went to Havana the same year in August. Boom, different cities, different countries. Mm-hmm. So that will happen. Other international situation related with Venezuela, with Russia, or China, I don't know. But in terms of the embargo, yes, of course. I think it's very easy to understand.
Well, I think this has been a very interesting panel, and I've gotten a lot of interesting questions. Some of the questions that I received and haven't conveyed are very specific, and I encourage the persons who ask those questions to write to the presenters directly to get their answers, and I apologize that we can't consider them at the moment. Larry has given me the message that it's time to wind this down. So I wanted to thank you for your participation and your PowerPoints, and I very much appreciate it. And I thank the audience for putting up with us and you know, the technical aspects of this new world that we live in that is all in the internet. So thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.